sitting on this side. If you were in an airplane, we'd make you move. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to those of you who just arrived. We're delighted to have you here for the next session, which is our prize ceremony. We have 4 genres here at Khalailah in our creative writing and translation program. And I'm happy that now, as of a couple of years ago, all 4 genres are represented with prizes as well. I think you all understand that prizes are a mixed bag. I mean, it's a shame that we have to have them sometimes, the competitive spirit in the arts, but they're such a prevalent part of everything that we do as artists that there's no escaping them. And so I'm very glad that we have our own prizes. So the 4 prizes that we will be awarding this evening, as you see, are poetry, nonfiction, fiction, and translation. And each one of them is named for someone, and we will tell you about those people for whom they are named as we get to each of the prizes. I am not going to repeat anything I just said. Too bad for the recording. It's my pleasure to invite Linda Ziskwit up for the first prize. Linda, where are you? Oh, right here. Linda Ziskwit is a renowned poet, and she was for many years on our poetry faculty in the program. And she knew very well Andy Moriah, and she's absolutely the right person to be opening up. So if you want to go up on stage, I'll hand over the microphone.
Now it's on? Yes. So Andy Moriah began to write seriously in her 50s after a challenging fight against leukemia. From the start, her poetry was fiercely and passionately alive. Her attention to detail, sounds, and smells, brilliant, evocative. And it was my privilege and pleasure to be Andy Moriah's teacher and then advisor for her thesis, and to help bring her final MA thesis to completion after her death. She translated the poetry of a Chilean poet, Nicanor Parra, from Spanish for a class project. She chose him for what she called his straight-shooting, plain-speaking anti-poetry. She told the story of a labor dispute when miners were blocked from joining the union, giving voice and complexity to the redneck miners. Andy herself was fiercely alive, and her poetry was straight-shooting and plain-speaking. And I believe her daughter, Michal, is here. Hi, Michal. And Michal, I want you to come to the stage. Are you going to speak about your mom? And Wendy Sandler, Andy's sister, who dedicated herself to Andy's work after her death, created the prize, and brought it to publication with this wonderful book.
I didn't bring it, I'm sorry to say, but you can contact me for it. We're going to read jazz first before we announce. Okay,
Here.
Wendy will do it for me because I lost my voice.
Your voice sounds pretty good to me,
But I just want to say that this poem, I think this is how my mom saw herself leave this world, which comes to show us all how she actually lived her life on this earth. You'll hear it in a minute.
Jazz. I'm downloading music for my trip to the hereafter, a sweet-wise blend of jazz, simple piano, guitar, percussion, sax, and bass. Got my shades, black turtleneck sweater, tight-ass blue jeans and boots, and I'm gone. No, wait. maybe some blues for the road.
And the winner of this year's Andrea Moriah Prize is Sabrina Licht, whose bold, honest, straight-shooting, plain-speaking poems are drawn from her own Spanish language and challenging background, what she calls, from one of her poems, a jungle you don't know how to pronounce, with its richness and drama, and they're filled with colors and energy. It's Sabrina's, is that yours? It's her keen power of observation and a fierce and uncompromising force of survival that charges her poetry and which I believe Andy would have admired. Sabrina? Sabrina's going to read one or maybe two of her poems. And it will be mimed.
Get a little. Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. This poem is called The Engagement Ring of the Lamuña Women. I rest in the hand of the youngest of the Lamuña women, hovering in the sand of Bogushov, reminding me of the beginnings of my making circa 1995. My head, an emerald hexagon, my feet, a diamond, my torso, a charred gold tuillo with crystal armor, designed by the eldest, Maria Jose, when in Santa Lucia, Guatemala. Maria Jose was a jeweler who learned everything from her husband, the watchmaker, including slaps across the face and kneeling in corn when dinner was not finished. She had 2 daughters and a son. The eldest, Maria, the middle, Demetrio, and Honorina, who changed her name to Nora, the youngest. None of them jewelers or slappers. Maria married at the age of 24. She dizzied me with her fidgeting, and I was never fond of her. Her gown was the most expensive, and she doesn't speak to her only son. Nora married shortly after and often flung me away with her bony flesh. She always kneeled in corn. She now has chronic leukemia, inherited from her father. Demetrio married years after to La Bajada del Monte. His mother refuses to name her. At last, I found quiet. They had 2 daughters, and they prayed together once a day, every day. Sabrina, the eldest, married her high school sweetheart last year and left Guatemala for good. And now, I get to rest in the sand of the Promised Land. Okay, and the second one is called Azaleas Sonadies, Ciudad de Guatemala. I come from a jungle you don't know how to pronounce, but brand. From a number imposed like a stamp watching Fox News. Yes, you. I won't fold for a one-liner because girls from the other side of this specific puddle can dance. What if I told you about collars compounded, combed, woven by women who wear them posing with pride, children carrying children in their womb, envenomed? What if I told you that Quetzal has a stain of blood on its chest, a symbol of resistance? Yet I misword a foreign word in this battlefield that is my tongue, and corners of its underbelly where colors were opaque. Or my mama says when the time comes, and it will come, scream, fight, poke their eyes, kick their balls, scratch, fight, survive. What if I told you I'm that witch from the woods who refuses to abide?
So our second prize for the evening. It's okay? Yes. Our second prize for this evening will be awarded by Ilana Blumberg, my colleague here, who is both an academic and a writer of nonfiction and teacher of nonfiction in our program. and she will introduce the Dave Greber Prize for Social Justice.
It's wonderful to see everybody here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dave Greber and then award the prizes. Dave Greber was a prolific working writer who was committed to rigorous professionalism of nonfiction freelance writing. A passionate stylist and technician, he crafted stories that were powerful, effective, and appealing. This is what his partner says about him. Dave was a quick study with a curious mind and a wicked sense of humor. He had an ability for telling stories across a variety of media and for a diverse range of markets and audiences. As a freelance writer in Calgary, Alberta, Dave wrote in a wide range of areas that included environmental issues and corporate responsibility for the environment. He encouraged young writers through his personal time and through his efforts as a writer in residence at the community college level. In the last decade before his death in 2000, Dave wrote at length about his experiences as a child of Holocaust survivors and gave voice to other survivors. He recognized that the current world was still prone to violence and that violence haunts its survivors. We are immensely grateful to his partner, Shirley Dunn, who has dedicated this prize to his vision and her establishment of this prize at Bar Ilan in his memory. I'll just say about Shirley that every time I get an email from her, it ends with something like, keep on writing. And she has a beautiful commitment to fostering writing among our students here. And so we're really very grateful to her. Tonight, we're going to give 2 awards, which we've done once in the past when we felt we have 2 students who deserve recognition for what they've written. We always award this prize through creative nonfiction, which is myself and Professor Bill Kohlbrenner, and we always have an outside reader also as a judge. Our outside reader, I will quote from her I'll quote from her to announce our first place winner, who is Emily Zimmer. And about Emily's essay, our outside judge said, "Exactly Where We Left Her," the title, is a moving and raw account of 2 daughters struggling with their capacity to care for a schizophrenic parent and with the limits of the legal and social service system in response to psychological illness. This candid and powerful essay calls attention to a dilemma with no easy answers. So we'll ask Emily to read, and then I will announce our second winner. Wonderful to have former winners of the Dave Greber Award among us.
Hi. At the office of the Justice of the Peace in Barrie, Ontario, Lexi pulled into a parking spot. It was May 2023, and we'd just finished the 2-hour drive from Toronto. The day before, we'd driven nearly 3 hours from Toronto to Novar to visit our mother. I flew in from Jerusalem, and Lexi flew in from LA. It had been over 10 years since we'd been young girls living in our mother's house out in the woods of northern Ontario. 10 years since we lived in fear of her erratic behavior, her unmedicated tirades, and her delusions. Growing up with Mom meant living in a world, her world, that was dictated by her untreated, paranoid schizophrenia, isolated in a small town that didn't know how to do anything other than take away her driver's license and send a social worker to school to meet with us every few months. Does your mother feed you? Make sure you have clothes? Do you have a place to do your homework? The social worker would ask us separately, later comparing our answers. Yes, we'd both reply, knowing we were telling the truth. Does your mother smoke or drink heavily? Does she ever yell at you? Does she hit you? Do you feel safe where you live? This is where the questions got harder to answer. Mom chain smoked cigarettes in the house. She spent her days sitting on the couch, inhaling smoke and exhaling the quietest laughter. She'd sip her coffee and chat with herself. It was harmless behavior. As a child, I never knew how to ask why Mom didn't work, didn't go anywhere during the day. Mom bought her cigarettes by the carton, but when she couldn't get herself to the store to pick them up, she had taxi drivers deliver them for her. And Mom did yell, almost every day. Sometimes she was yelling into the phone, directing her frustrations into the answering machine of some government office or family member who would never pick up. But mostly, she was yelling at Lexi and I, calling us stupid little brats, pulling us by our hair, accusing us of not caring about our own mother. And setting off Mom was easy as talking to her at the wrong time or asking her a question she didn't want to answer. Once we tried asking Mom if she could tell us about our father, as we'd noticed from television that most kids have 2 parents, but Mom didn't like that question at all. At the Justice of the Peace, Lexi and I had a plan. For years, we discussed getting power of attorney over Mom, and today was our chance. This way, we could help Mom get medical aid, perhaps even get her medicated long enough to help her have a lucid thought. We could handle Mom's finances, the property taxes she wasn't paying on both her home in Novar and her apartment in Toronto, bills that hadn't been touched, we found out, since my grandmother passed away in 2021. So when Mom wasn't looking, Lexi and I took videos and pictures of the house. We'd been advised by lawyers in the past that we would need evidence, that a court would want pictures, recordings, paperwork in order to grant us any sort of guardianship over our mother. The state of the house to us was shocking, but not unexpected. I kept anticipating the mice from my childhood to run out from under the washing machine, or an army of ghosts to emerge from the toy box. But the only ghost in the house was Mom, and she'd been haunting it for a decade, alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, and our second place award goes to Vivian Cohen-Leisorek. And our outside reader says, Vivian's The Geography of Loss responds to the many forms of bereavement experienced by a nation in a time of war. The essay's catalog of loss, including invisible forms of mourning, charts a country in an extended, ongoing period of loss and explores accompanying grief with eloquence and sensitivity. Vivian.
Thank you. I'm going to read just the first couple of pages, no worries. The Geography of Loss. The lands of loss are vast, but not all mourning is considered equal. There's a category of close relatives, the parents, siblings, spouses, and children, on whom we focus our energies after a loss. We bring them food, try to console them, offer support. In Jewish tradition, their internal grief is made explicit. Their clothes are torn, and their homes filled with visitors, particularly in the first 7 days of mourning. Even beyond that initial period, their suffering is acknowledged, labeled with new names. Parents become bereaved parents, wives become widows, children become orphans. There's also a category of territories beyond the immediate circles of loss, where the pain can run just as deep, though it's not always apparent. These are the lands of the uncles and cousins, the grandparents, the teachers, and the close friends. In the case of a sudden death, and especially that of a young person, this is the same group of people expected to provide the bulk of the support of the close relatives, a role that extends for years, even decades. But the grief of these lands remains under the surface, partly out of respect for the immediate family, and partly because the rest of us simply fail to notice. But being farther from the epicenter doesn't always mean the aftershocks are less intense. Who then, if anyone, is supporting the rest? I'm a bereaved aunt, declared a member of my synagogue a few months ago during the informal gathering our community organized to mark the 30 days since her nephew, a reserve soldier, fell in battle. Even if that phrase doesn't exist. I thought about her words while walking home from synagogue. I did not think they were meant as a signal to ask for help with logistics or because she lacked somebody to talk to, though I made a mental note of raising this in the next meeting of our synagogue's mutual aid committee. The main point, I realized, was that she needed to be seen, her pain acknowledged, and, after the initial shock, her de facto status as a mourner recognized. As a community and a society, we were clearly missing something important. I thought of the aunts and uncles from both sides of the family in the Shiva of my son's best friend, Staff Sergeant Levi Lifshitz. 3 months prior, I had spent a lot of time in that Shiva, since I was part of the group of close friends who organized the meals and divided themselves up into shifts to manage logistics. This way, there would always be someone in charge of bringing out more pastries, taking out the trash, refilling the hot water urn, or running to the store to get more milk. Tasks that, in normal Shivas, other relatives take on. But when a 20-year-old is killed, we quickly learned, the extended family is also paralyzed. Lavi's grandparents sat unofficial Shiva in the living room, surrounded by their elderly friends. Outside, the aunts, uncles, and cousins claimed their stake of their parking lot and took over the garden between apartments, receiving their own sets of visitors who huddled around them in ever-changing constellations of plastic chairs. Thank you.
To make some logic for you of how this event is working, the people who are presenting these awards are, each of us, we're associated with the genre that we're representing this evening. So we had Linda and Marcella for poetry, and Ilana for nonfiction, and I'm here to represent both fiction and literary translation. So our next prize is the Bar Sagi Fiction Prize. On the 26th of February 2017, at the age of just 15, Bar Sagi passed away after a terrible battle with bone cancer. Born in Rehovot, Bar's greatest delight was reading, and later, as she sought to deal with her suffering, her fear of death, and her hopes for recovery, her love of reading expanded to writing. In fact, she left behind 2 full-length books, several short stories, and 25 poems. Bar's grandparents, the Josephs, chose to memorialize her by providing opportunities to up-and-coming writers through this prize. So Marcella Shulak will read a poem, a short piece by Bar, and then we'll announce the winner of this year's prize. And we're honored to have the family with us today. Thank you for being here with us.
And I also just want to thank Dani Aragon, who's miming our presentations here. I'm going to read The Windsurfer, and I'm going to read an excerpt from it. On a surprisingly windy day, a windsurfer went to the beach. It was a perfect day for surfing. And as his wife was there too, well, it was bound to be a good day, even though it was his birthday. Heading to the ocean, he grimaced as he massaged that old muscle that always acted up. He hated getting older, and today he was turning 70. He was becoming useless, unable to do anything that would affect anyone. He could feel it with every year that passed. Useless, worthless. Those words weighed him down. As he surfed on the waves, straying farther from the beach than he usually did, he heard a scream. Shading his eyes against the sun, he looked for the sound of the voice. In the edge of his eyesight, he saw a small island with a little boy clinging onto a rock. The windsurfer surfed over to the little island and called the boy to grab on. As the little boy got into a safe position, the windsurfer looked out to the ocean, On one side, he could barely see the beach, and he knew his wife would be worried. On the other side, a storm was coming, so he fought his way to the beach against some of the strongest winds he had ever surfed against. Every wave he fought against made his bone ache for effort. He felt tiredness begin to cling to him, trying to drag him down in the storm. This was bigger than him now. All he knew was that he couldn't fail. He just had to bring the little boy to safety. When at last he got to the beach, soaked with sweat and seawater, Tony almost collapsed. The lifeguards were putting up red flags, and all the windsurfers had gone home. Ignoring Thomas's protest that he was a big boy, almost a teenager, Tony looked up at the sky. Well, we'd better get out of here. The storm is here. As if in agreement, a loud rumble swept throughout the sky.
Thank you, Marcella. Thank you, Danny. And I feel rather confident saying that if Bar were still with us, she'd probably be coming to study creative writing with us pretty soon. The winner of this year's Bar Sagi Prize is Lior Zoe Perets for her story Forbidden Fruit. And I'm going to ask Lior Zoe to come up and read a bit of Forbidden Fruit to us.
I'm just pulling it up. This is a fictionalized account of Adam and Eve's daughters and their life. I'll read the first page. Unsurprisingly, news of their brother's murder triggers an argument among the world's sisters. I have a duty to this world you two do not, the oldest girl says, elbows jutting out as she grinds wheat into flour. I was created to be my mother's replacement. I cannot atone for her sins with the sinner. I deserve the third. You were created to be the first's wife, the middle sister disagrees. She ties her hair back with willow rope before joining the table. You can still fulfill your role. Your intended took mine from me. I deserve the third. The oldest straightens. It is my birthright to marry first. I will choose whom I please. Have you learned nothing from my brother's pride? The second sister says. You have no birthright. The youngest sister rises before the eldest can respond, pushing her bowl of grain away. I'm going to see our mother, she says, and gathering a few fresh bread cakes, leaves before either of them answer. The dwelling their father built for them sits unnaturally in the field, the only thing in the world God did not create himself. The girl does not look back at it as she leaves, nor at her father and her remaining brothers toiling beyond it. When she was younger, she had been curious about the men's punishment, wondering what it would be like to repent with sweat every day instead of blood once a month. Before their sin, her parents had lived in God's garden. 4 sweetwater rivers flowed through the paradise. Crops bore them fruit without any labor. Like their late brother with his flock, their parents lacked for nothing under God's shepherding. And it still wasn't enough for you, she thinks, whenever their parents recount their lives before. But she was born with knowledge and knows when to stay silent, so she never shares her thoughts. She knows where to find her mother, standing vigil over her brother's grave. Her heart spasms in pity at the sight of her. God had told her she would birth her children in sorrow. He had not warned her she would lose them too. Thank you.
So to present the award is Varsagi's grandfather, Professor Anthony Joseph.
When I saw the name of Lior, I thought, finally a man.
You didn't see the Zoe.
Well, it wouldn't have made much difference. Here's the award, and here's the poetry book of Bar. I would like to thank Marcella and Eran for organizing this literature session, and of course to Danny Algon for doing the miming. My mother and my sister were great fans of Marcel Marceau, and my sister, who claims to know about these things, said that the whole story of Bar the storm was a cancer which was slowly growing up, and the windsurfer was maybe a surgeon who was going to save it. Didn't work out, but that's the point of the story. Well, I don't know. Yes. Okay, so maybe you were the... Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our final prize this evening is the Sandy Nairn Literary Translation Prize. Sandy Nairn was born in Queensland, Australia in the 1930s. She had an early successful career as a nurse, specializing in pediatrics, and later working with aged patients with dementia, where she demonstrated an uncanny ability to communicate with people who had lost their language. Her husband, Mal, was one of the founders of Murdoch University in Western Australia in the 1970s. Recognizing the isolation felt by those who had traveled to the remote state to join the university, Sandy established a successful association, later known as the Banskia Club, to provide hospitality and companionship to the partners and families of overseas and interstate academics. She helped people from all cultures to make friends and adjust to their new life, embodying the essence of what it means to communicate across language barriers and cultures. And we had a number of translations in prose and poetry. It was a very difficult choice. They were all wonderful. This year's winner is Karam Khalailah, who will read from the poetry that he translated by Ahmad Shauki, The Greatest Incidents in the Valley of the Nile. Karam. And we asked Karam to read both his translation and at least part of the original in Arabic.
Ooh. So I'm going to read the Arabic first. Oh. Oh, the microphone? Oh, am I that tall? Okay, so in Arabic poetry, there's a rhyme scheme that was popular, and it was widely used until the last century, when Romanticism showed up in Arabic poetry. And it's basically where no matter how long the poem is, no matter what it is about, it's going to have the same rhyme. It's called the mono-rhyme. Whether it's 100 lines, 10 lines, 3 lines, it's going to have the same rhyme. You'll notice it now. I'm going to read complete. It has multiple, it talks about multiple events. It's summarizing the whole history. So I'm going to read a complete part. لا تسلني ما دولة الفرس ساءت دولة الفرس في البلاد وساء أمة همها الخرائب تبليها وحق الخرائب الإعلاء سلبت مصر عزها وكستها ذلة ما لها الزمان انقضاء وارتوى سيفها فعاجلها الله بسيف ما إن له إرواء طلبة للعباد كانت لإسكندر في نيلها اليد البيضاء شاد إسكندر لمصر بناء لم تشده الملوك والأمراء بلدا يرحل الأنام إليه ويحج الطلاب والحكماء عاش عمرا في البحر ثغر المعالي والمنار الذي به الاهتداء مطمئنا من الكتائب والكتب بما ينتهي إليه العلاء يبعث الضوء للبلاد فتسري في سناه الفهوم والفهماء والجوار في البحر يظهرن عز الملك والبحر صولة وثراء والرعايا في نعمة ولبطليموس في الأرض دولة علياء فقضى الله أن تضيع هذا الملك أنثى صعب عليها الوفاء اتخذتها روما إلى الشر تمهيدا وتمهيده بأنثى بلاء فتناهى الفساد في هذه الأرض وجاز الأبالس الإغواء ضيعت قيصر البرية أنثى يا لربي مما تجر النساء فتنت منه كهف روما المرجى والحسام الذي به الاتقاء قاهر الخصم والجحافل مهما جد هول الوغى وجد اللقاء فأتاها من ليس تملكه أنثى ولا تسترقه هيفاء بطل الدولتين حامي حمى روما الذي لا تقوده الأهواء أخذ الملك وهي في قبضة الأفعى عن الملك والهوى عمياء سلبتها الحياة فاعجب لرقطاء أراحت منها الورى رقطاء لم تصب بالخداع نجحا ولكن خدعوها بقولهم حسناء قتلت نفسها وظنت فداء صغرت نفسها وقل الفداء سل كليوبترة المكايد هلا صدها عن ولاء روما الدهاء فبروما تأيدت وبروما هي تشقى وهكذا الأعداء ولروما الملك الذي طالما وافاه في السر نصحها والولاء وتولت مصرا يمين على المصري من دون ذا الورى عصراء تسمع الأرض قيصرا حين تدعو وعقيم من أهل مصر الدعاء وينيل الورى الحقوق فإن نادته مصر فأذنه صماء فاصبري مصر للبلاء وأنى لك والصبر للبلاء بلاء ذا الذي كنت تلتجين إليه ليس منه إلى سواه النجاء. It was difficult in English. Very difficult. So what I did was the common one in the common rhyme scheme in English, which is rhyming couplets. So it's not as good. Ask me not of the Persian Empire. They ruin lands and make them dire. They simply destroy and vandalize. The ruins their glory immortalize. Stole Egypt's glory and pride and spread shame far and wide. When they became full, Allah sent a hungry nation as punishment. Alexander, a prayer answered, had the Persians defeated and deterred, and built structures unseen before. No king built like them, and that men adore. A country that people live for, and the wise cannot ignore. Lived glorious life and thriving, a lighthouse for the stray, always guiding. Relying on books and armies, they brought him the quickest glories. Shining a light to all the lands, leading the wise and who understands. The ships sail, declaring glory and prosperity to the king. People are pleased, and Ptolemy has a state of glory and quality. Allah willed that his reign is lost to a female that loyalty never crossed. Rome used her for its own sake. Using her was a great mistake. So corruption spread in the land, and devils tainted its land. Caesar of the people, tricked by a female, my lord, how sly. She tempted the shelter of Rome, the sword that protected home. Conqueror of foes and wars, who danger and risk ignores. Then he who does not fall for a female came to take it all. Saving the two empires, protects Rome and adds to titles he collects. Took from the snake the rule, away from any blind lust that tries to lure. Took her life, wonder how a snake saves the world from another snake. She failed with all her trickery, was tricked when they praised her beauty. She died and thought highly of her cause, unfortunately. Ask Cleopatra whether her wits helped her against Rome and her tricks. And Rome, that always has ruled, through loyalty all are subdued. Egypt was taken under the hands of another tyrant and withstands. Caesars can hear the land praying, asking for change and begging. Subjects earn all rights and wealth. With Egypt, the Caesars turn deaf. Be patient, Egypt. What to do? These situations are not new. Whatever you seek to shelter you needs shelter from whom has created you. Oh, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, no. Yeah, I'm just going to do it this way. I'll never get this thing down to my level. We should have chosen someone shorter for this prize. Before we wrap up, I want to just say again, thank you to all the people who made this possible, to the people who submitted work, to the students who submitted work for these prizes, who all deserve prizes. This is the hard part about the prizes. Everybody deserves an award, and obviously that doesn't happen with prizes. I want to thank Marcela for organizing all of this, Danny Aragon, our wonderful mime for this evening. Thank you so much. And one thing that maybe all of you noticed and that we all know in the writing world is that a lot of writing comes from pain. And you heard some of the writing that came from pain, and you see some of these prizes that have been established because of pain and suffering. And I think maybe, as I said in my comments yesterday when we opened the conference, at least we have that. And if we don't make good on this pain, if we don't turn it into something beautiful, something for art, which is really, Hedda Rudolph, her daughter Shandy, is the one who started this whole program. And, we sorely miss her. But that was what she was doing as well. She was making something beautiful. And you as the family have continued that beauty with us for all these years. So I don't want to leave anyone out of this, but I want to thank everybody who had something to do with this and of turning pain and suffering and just life into something beautiful that we can all hold on to. So thank you for being part of this evening, and please stay for a reception. There should be food out there, if not now, then pretty soon, and also to hear a wonderful conversation between Alana Blumberg and Ruth Franklin that starts at 7 o'clock. Thank you.
I'm going to ask that you all enter the auditorium and that you mute your phones, please. This is going to be a very tiny introduction, just a few words of welcome here. Good evening, everyone. I'm Marcella Schulak, the director of the Shandy Rudolph Graduate Program in Creative Writing, and I would like to welcome you to the second night of our 10th biennial Shandy Rudolph Graduate Program in Creative Writing Conference at Bar-Ilan University. And yesterday I just mentioned the counting of the Omer, so I'm just going to do that again as a way of moving into tonight. At sunset, this is the 42nd day, which is 6 weeks of the Omer, and it's Malchut and Yesod. The attribute of Yesod is literally foundation or communal bonding. Yesod is the foundation upon which God has built the world, and as I mentioned yesterday, it also serves as a transmitter between the Sfirot above and the reality below. Insofar as we focus tonight and tomorrow on Malchut, bonding must enhance a person's sovereignty. It should nurture and strengthen your dignity and the dignity of the one you bond with. And we can probably think of no other people that are going to do this strengthening of our communal bond with more integrity than Ilana Bloomberg and Ruth Franklin. And so we're very, very pleased to have them with us tonight. And I'm going to let Ilana introduce Ruth, but I'm thanking you all very much for being here all day long. I want to do a little shout out to the winners of our student prizes, Lior Zoe Perets, Sabrina Licht, Khalailah, and Emily Zimmer, and Vivian Cohen-Leisorek. I just want to also thank, since you're here, I know it looks most of the time like everything is flowing pretty seamlessly, except that we ran out of food except for vegetables right now. But it's all thanks to Karen Berkowitz, Vivian Cohen-Leisorek, and Rachel Sevitt. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. Are people hearing me? Yeah? Okay. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to welcome all our guests, especially the Rudolph family, all our faculty, so many alumni, and our students. So it's just really a delight to see everybody here. I'm also especially thrilled to get to welcome Ruth Franklin. My students got to read her last week in a sneak preview of her new book, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I want to first give her an introduction so that all of you can get to know her as well. Ruth is a book critic and former editor at the New Republic. Her first biography was about Shirley Jackson, the writer. Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. We're going to talk about biography as a genre. And was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2016, a Time Magazine Top Nonfiction Book of 2016, and a Best Book of 2016 by too many newspapers to count. Ruth also has written for The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, and Harper's. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Biography, a Coleman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a Leon Levy Fellowship in Biography, and the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism. And Ruth's, I believe it's your first book, A Thousand Darknesses, was about representation of the Holocaust in fiction and nonfiction. And some of the things we're going to take up tonight have to do with the lines between fiction and nonfiction, where diary fits in those, among those categories. And I'm just really thrilled to have you here with us. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
No, it's still not. Press. You want? Oh, that sounds like it's working.
Press and hold. Okay. Is it on now? Yes. Okay. Thank you. What was I going to say? Thank you.
Who knows?
Okay. Thank you, Ilana. Thank you, Marcella, and everyone else here. It's such an honor to be invited to speak here.
Okay. So we're going to jump right in. As I said, my lucky students got to taste a little bit of Ruth's forthcoming book. And Ruth has written a biography of Anne Frank. And I think that that's in itself a kind of interesting thing, because I think probably lots of people who have read the Diary of Anne Frank may feel that they've already read a biography of Anne Frank, that they know the life story, that they know what there is to be known. And so I thought I would start by asking Ruth to tell us a little bit about her project and what it means particularly to think about writing a biography of someone who has written their own life.
Absolutely. Well, do you want me to start by reading from the introduction, and then I'll try to answer your question?
That's great.
Okay, so just to begin with, I feel a little bit uncomfortable calling this book a biography of Anne Frank. It's a book for the Yale Jewish Lives series of short biographies, which some of you might be familiar with. These books are generally not traditional biographies, thank you, but are kind of more essayistic and experimental takes on a life, and that's definitely the vein in which I picture this book. I would say that, the fact that somebody has written an autobiography doesn't mean that they don't necessarily also need a biography, because those are two such different forms where different questions come into play. But in terms of Anne Frank, of course, it's not possible in any way to write a book that's a traditional biography. The way we think of that genre, cradle to grave, including a massive, drawing on a large archive with interviews and all the other accoutrements that I was, lucky to have come into play in my biography of Shirley Jackson are obviously not in the picture at all. What we have for Anne Frank are her diary, of course, in its multiple versions, which we'll get into, as well as, a handful of reminiscences and recollections from her classmates and other people who knew her, and a handful of other materials, her fiction writing, a few letters, other things like that. And so it was clear to me from the beginning that any kind of biographical project was going to have to be more experimental in nature. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. But just to start, the book is part biographical study that brings in, as well as narrating the story of Anne's life, brings in a lot of historical and social context about the Holocaust in the Netherlands and the specific way in which the Nazis persecuted the Jews there, which was in fact very different from the way they carried out operations in Eastern Europe and some of the other places that are better known. So there's that component. And then the other part of the book is what I'm calling Anne Frank in quotes, which is a cultural study of the idea of Anne Frank as it's developed and changed in the decades since her diary was first published. And it goes through a lot of variations depending on what country we're in, what decade we're in, and what the other pressures on Jewish life are at the time, and ends in our current day with the different uses that people are making of Anne Frank's image now. So I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs of the book, which I hope will give you a flavor of for both the tone and some of the methodology that I'm using here. And the book is called The Many Lives of Anne Frank, and it's structured in 13 different sections, each of which treats Anne from a different perspective, with a kind of different identity for her. And the identity for her in this introduction is icon. They congregate on the plaza outside the entrance to Prinsengracht 263, beside a kiosk selling tickets for tours of Amsterdam and another offering traditional Dutch pancakes. Children with school groups, teenagers sulkily accompanying their parents, college students on a backpacking adventure, older couples who have saved up for a long-awaited European vacation. They come from just about everywhere: the United States, Canada, Puerto Rico, England, Wales, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Spain, France, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, the Czech Republic, the Philippines, South Korea, Israel, Tunisia, Germany, so many from Germany. They wear jeans and crop tops, tank tops and sun hats, t-shirts that say Levi's or Led Zeppelin or the names of their schools. Some of them pose for photos by the front door, striking a sexy or silly pose, and post the results on Instagram. If they happen to be there at the top of the hour, when the bells on the Westertoren clock above the plaza play their melancholy tune, they may look up in recognition, remembering what Anne wrote about that sound. I loved it from the start, and especially in the night, it's like a faithful friend. Many of them have come because of the diary. They read it in school or on their own, once or many times over. They tried to picture Anne's hiding place, the swinging bookcase, the steep stairs, the darkened rooms where she and her parents, together with the Van Pels family and the dentist, Fritz Pfeffer, cooked and slept and studied and used the toilet and argued and listened to the radio and did everything that people do, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 760 days straight, never stepping outdoors, never seeing the sun. The experience of visiting these rooms can be profoundly emotional. Taking photos or video is not permitted. No screen can mediate between the visitors and the space. Many people comment on how much smaller it is than they expected. I first visited at age 8, after having read the diary for the first time. Little as I was, I found it impossibly cramped. Returning 40 years later, now well into middle age, my body registered how rickety and steep the staircases were, set at such a narrow angle that I banged my knee while climbing up. The diary is one of the best-selling nonfiction books of all time. Still, many of the visitors haven't read it. They're here because they're visiting Amsterdam and the Anne Frank House is a must-see, along with the Rijksmuseum and the Red Light District. In 1952, after the diary became a surprise bestseller in the United States, Otto Frank, Anne's father, found that visitors spontaneously appeared at Prinsengracht 263, which then still housed his business, wanting to see Anne's, quote, secret annex. Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, longtime employees of Otto who helped to sustain the family in hiding, would show them around. Otto used the proceeds from the enormously successful Broadway adaptation of the diary and the movie version that followed to purchase and restore the building, which had been in danger of collapse owing to disrepair. He imagined it not as a dead monument, but as an international youth center. In 1960, the year it opened, 6,000 people came. Within 30 years, that number had climbed to 300,000. Now, along with Madame Tussauds and the Louvre, the Anne Frank House is one of the most popular museums in Europe, admitting some 70 tourists every 15 minutes from 9 a.m. until 10 p.m. every day, including Christmas and New Year's. Nearly 1.3 million people per year. Tickets sell out weeks in advance. At least as much as the diary, this building represents Anne to the world, a living monument in her name. But in the decades since her death, Anne Frank herself has become not just a person who once lived, breathed, and wrote, but a symbol, a secret door that opens into a kaleidoscope of meanings, most of which her legions of fans understand incompletely, if at all.
Thank you. I think when we consider the way in which Anne Frank has became quite early, even internationally known, one of the things that's fascinating is to consider how differently the idea of Anne Frank plays in different parts of the world. I'm curious in the audience here if you could raise your hand if you've read The Diary of Anne Frank. Okay, so that's pretty fascinating.
Is there anybody who hasn't read The Diary of Anne Frank?
No shame.
No shame, okay.
Yeah, no shame at all. Because really, when you're part of different communities, and we have different communities that are represented in our student body, one of the things that's fascinating is to understand what is the canon, what are the accepted and received texts that we hold sacred, that we all read, that we're assigned in school, and those contribute to our identity, whether it's national identity, religious, ethnic. And so when we have a group and everybody raises their hand, or almost everybody raises their hand, that tells us a lot about what we value as a particular community or sub-community. And one of the things I discovered in the last few days when I was researching this is that the Diary of Anne Frank used to be assigned as a required reading in Israeli schools. Not only was it assigned as a required reading, it was used for testing reading comprehension. So it wasn't necessarily a text that was used to teach about the Shoah or to teach about life in Europe. No, it was like, read this paragraph, can you spit back what you've just read? So it was both an instrumental text, but it was also a text that was considered classic. And in the United States as well, I think many people many students over decades read it in school. And from my very informal surveying, it's not assigned nearly so much anymore as it used to be. And I'm curious what you think about the way in which it's sort of gone out of fashion, and if something has replaced that, or just what your thoughts are about the way in which in these two different societies, in the United States and in Israel, we see less of an emphasis on this text as an iconic one or a classic one.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I feel much more authoritative commenting on the United States than Israel. But, in terms of the text going out of fashion, I think, the diary kind of had its heyday, as it were. Well, in the 50s, it came out in the US in 1952 and became an instant bestseller. And Otto Frank always emphasize the extent to which he hoped that the book would appeal to a broad audience, that is not just a Jewish audience, but to everyone. And in the American marketing of the book, which is something, some of you might be aware that the Broadway adaptation, for instance, the first Broadway adaptation has been criticized prominently by a lot of critics for being overly American, for emphasizing Anne's kind of universality and making her into something like an American teenager. And one of the things I argue in this book is that that was present in the book's marketing in America from the beginning. The publisher, which was Doubleday, as well as Otto Frank, really wanted this, they wanted the book to be read by the largest possible number of people. And the way to do that was to make Anne accessible, right? To make her approachable, to make the Franks feel, as Meyer Levin wrote in his New York Times review of the diary, that they could be your neighbors. And I think, for American Jews in 1952, many of whom will have had family who had perished in the war, or who themselves had, narrowly escaped the war by emigrating, in many cases just years before it began. I think that feeling of Anne, of potentially sharing Anne's fate must have been very visceral. At the same time, there was this tremendous pressure on them to assimilate and to prove that, in fact, they were just like all other Americans. They were just like the people next door. And so there you see this kind of stepping away from emphasizing Anne's Judaism. And, what many people know about Anne's religion, right, is that the Franks were very assimilated Jews. It's often said that they celebrated Christmas, which is not exactly true. That's one of the many myths about Anne. But so I think in some ways, Otto Frank and the publishers were almost too successful in the extent to which Anne's diary, just became omnipresent in American, in American life through the play and then the movie version, and then in American schools. I think probably, in the time that we were growing up, and around the world, as I describe in the book. I have one story of an Ethiopian, an Eritrean man who discovers the diary in a refugee camp. I interview a Japanese woman who teaches the diary as part of the Holocaust studies she does in Tokyo. I talk a little bit about the diary's reception in South Africa and the way it was read by prisoners on Robben Island, including Nelson Mandela and others. Which I find, personally, I find it so moving and powerful, the idea that this book about the Holocaust can have disseminated throughout the world in the way that it did and had such a powerful impact. At the same time, I think now it's become sort of a victim of its own success, in that, I've experienced when I've approached people and offered to talk about Anne Frank, for instance, at my kids' schools or at their Hebrew school, I've been often kind of, politely rebuffed by teachers who, communicate in no uncertain terms that they think Anne Frank is kind of passé. And, I think because it's the Holocaust book of all of our childhoods. But of course, we can't move on to some new Holocaust book exactly. There is this new graphic adaptation of the diary that's, I think, in some ways renewed its presence in schools, although part of what we also see in the United States is that version especially is being attacked by conservative parents who are objecting to its LGBT content, and I can explain that in further detail if you want, but that version is clearly out there just because of the amount of criticism it's receiving. So, I think there is a sense that maybe, that there's a desire for something new, which seems to me quite ironic when it's the Holocaust and Holocaust education that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, at least, and maybe this is true for some of you, the quote that was most often associated with Anne Frank was something like, "After all, I still believe that people are good at heart." And I remember as a teenager feeling like, wow, that is really just, there's something like so namby-pamby about that, and it just sounds like a Hallmark card, and I'm not interested. But then, when I go back and I read the diary, that is one thought among many thoughts, and there are some very, very dark passages, and there are also passages that are far less universalist, that are not about being a human being, but about being a Jew in a particular place at a particular time. And I think that when you actually confront the diary itself, I just reread it last week, it is so sharp. It's such a sharp document to me of a mind at work. And someone who is not passing on cliches, but wants to fight cliches pretty strenuously. And what I was struck by when I reread it was the sense of Anne as a writer, and what a voice she has from early in the diary. And I wanted you to talk to us a little bit about Anne as a writer, because one of the things that we were discussing in class is the way that the diary is really not a typical diary, because a typical diary is not an edited form. And I'll let Ruth say more about this because her book takes this up so closely. But one of the fascinating things when you think about diary is that it's private. Also, people have little locks and keys. When you get a first diary, you can often kind of hide it somewhere because it's meant to be a secret. And Anne's diary, as you said, is is a bestseller around the world. That's the opposite of a diary in that way too. So I want to think a little bit about the way this diary has been wrested out of the typical structures of diary, but also the ways in which Anne herself was ready for that.
Yeah, so before I jump into that, I would just wonder if we could have another show of hands. How many people here are aware that Anne revised her own diary? Okay. Good amount, okay. So the first answer to your question is, Anne's diary isn't a typical diary because the version that we read is not really a diary, in the sense that we understand it. If we understand a diary to be, as I think the common definition is, a work, a text written chronologically in order at the time, concurrently with the dates that it is labeled with and with the experience that it covers, then the version we read is not a diary. And as Francine Prose has described it in a phrase that I think is really apt, it's a memoir in diary form. And of course, you could go a step further and say, it's not even really in diary form because the diary itself is written in the form of letters. So it's a diary in epistolary form that was revised as a memoir. And so, Anne, I think it's important to understand it as, yeah.
So when you say a memoir, you're thinking of a retrospective account of a life, in the sense that you're looking backward and you're able to see something in retrospect that you couldn't have seen moving forward.
Exactly. And I think, so that accounts for some of, I remember, frankly, as a kid, having some of the same reaction to Anne's diary as you described, that, no one could possibly have thought this. I remember, in particular, reacting to one entry that appears early on. It's actually the entry that appears in the revised published version. It appears right before the first entry in the annex. And in it, Anne describes taking a walk with her father. They're walking through a park, and she confesses to him her fears about what's going to happen to them. There's the Nazis are closing in all around. There are rumors that people are going to start being called up soon. What is going to happen? And he says, don't worry, preparations are being taken, but for now, just live your peaceful life, and just enjoy life the best as you can. And she ends that entry with something like, oh, may those dark words, not come true anytime soon. She says it more coherently than that. And then the very next entry is, here we are in the annex. Sorry, do I really have to hold this down? No, okay. So I remember as a child reacting to that, oh, may those dark that dark prophecy not come true yet, and feeling like this is a little too much. Is this real? And so I wasn't surprised when I went back over the revised versions of the diary, because now there's this critical edition in which you can compare the A version, which is Anne's rough draft, which is actually incomplete. Well, it's the real diary in some ways, right? But it's incomplete. One of the notebooks has been lost. And then there's the B version, which is the revision that she did herself, intending it to be published or at least read after the war as a testimony. And we know this because she records in the diary hearing a Dutch government minister on the radio calling for Dutch citizens to preserve their documents of the war years for a national archive that would later be created. And this was in late March 1944. So at this point, she's been in hiding for almost 2 years. And after hearing him, she spent a couple of months then thinking over how she was going to do this. And then she began revising her diary at this incredible pace, maybe up to a dozen pages a day. And so by the time of her arrest in August 1944, she had in fact reached that point, that very same entry, bringing it around full circle, that very same entry about the Dutch government minister. And that's the B version, the version that she intended to publish. And by comparing it to the A version, you can see the changes that she made, especially in the beginning, where her 13-year-old voice is, immature. It's very childish. She's writing about things like playing with dolls. That is how young she is at this point. And when she comes back to it, almost 2 years later, she's 15 now. There's a big difference between a 15-year-old girl and a 13-year-old girl. I think, especially for one who spent 2 years under such intense pressure. And you can see the evolution in her voice as a writer and as a thinker. So that's the B version. And then there's the C version, which is the version that her father published. And in many ways, it's faithful to her edits, and in some ways it's not. And we can get into that if you're interested. But so I wasn't surprised to discover that this entry that had struck me with a false note as a child was one that Anne made up for the revision. When she went back to those early entries, she saw that they were, in fact, inadequate. They didn't explain what had happened to her, and they didn't explain much about the situation in the Netherlands prior to the family going into hiding. What are they about? They have gossip about her classmates. They have a lot of stuff about her boyfriend at the time. There's, her birthday party, going out for ice cream, other things like that. There isn't any context about the Holocaust in the Netherlands. And she saw when she went back to the beginning that the reader needed that in order to understand what was about to happen to her. And so she revised these entries, she condensed them, she rewrote things, wholesale from the beginning, and she added a few extra entries to make the story better, to make it more understandable. And so as a biographer, the question then becomes, what do I do with these, quote unquote, fake entries, which were, of course, written by Anne Frank, but they clearly need to fall more under the category of memoir than of a primary source, like as you would normally consider a diary to be, right?
I have so many thoughts and so many questions, but I think what I want to say is that I kind of interrupted you and I said the real diary, version A, meaning Anne Frank at 13, getting this diary, writing about her birthday presents, writing about every single kid in her class, it seems, everyone.
In not such a nice way.
In not such a nice way, and being a 13-year-old on the page. And there's a part of me that is so moved by that because it's so real. It's like, here's the 13-year-old unmediated by the editing 15-year-old self, the 13-year-old who's got no clue what's coming.
Absolutely.
I mean, maybe she's afraid. She's got some fear about the future in terms of politics and in terms of, but she's got no clue where things are headed really. And that to me is so, it's so immediate. And it makes me think of what the theorist Philippe Lejeune, everybody in my class, be listening please, what he says that what is a diary? It touches time. It's touching time. And he says that the one thing that makes a diary is that entries are dated. And I just love this because it's, first of all, it's so material. It's like, oh, now it's a diary, now it's not. You know, you date it, it's a diary. But that sense of you have access to this person at the moment they were at without future knowledge. And the memoir is the future knowledge casting you, into a position of knowledge. And I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which it is a fake entry, let's say, but it's also,
I hate to use the word fake.
Right,
Because,
I think we need some other term.
The diary was also accused of being a forgery, so there's all that. But,
the edited.
A fictional, I don't know.
Yeah, like some kind of, the edited diary maybe is just the most, kind of neutral way to describe it.
A new entry.
A new entry, right. But I think that, when we think about Anne as a diary keeper, there's something important about the fact that even before she knew that they would be looking later, for an archive, she wanted to keep a diary. And she says in the diary that she wants a friend. But there does seem to be an attachment to understanding the passage of time. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about this idea that a diary is less a product than it is a process, and that diary is a way of being. It's a practice. So now I'm going to ask, the more intrusive question, which is, are there people here who keep diaries? Do you consider them diaries? Are they journals? Are they diaries? And that is not a memoir, right? And how many of us would like it if our diary, was suddenly available to the reading public? Blogs are kind of a weird, interesting public diary, but those of you who keep diaries, it's really worth thinking about, where do you write them? When do you write them? How much do you feel you need to provide context? Do you imagine an audience? Do you not imagine an audience? Do you imagine someone's going to break into your room and read it? Siblings, right?
Parents, right? Do you imagine yourself as a future reader of your diary?
Right. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about Anne and the process of diary.
I think the process is so fascinating and important. Philippe Lejeune, who I also am fascinated by his work, has this great line about revising the diary that I quote in my book, where he says, in order to fit all the material from a diary, because a diary makes meaning out of so many other ways than just the words on the page, but it's also the notebook that it's written in, the pen, all the stuff that you might put in your diary. Anne's original diary had, note cards from people, it had a birth announcement from friends, photographs, all that kind of stuff that you might put in. And then in revising it as a text for publication, all that material is either lost or, symbolized in some way. And Lejeune calls that process, he compares it to the act of putting a sponge into a matchbox. And I think that's just such a wonderful image and gives a sense of how hard Anne's task was. And I think during that couple of months when she was thinking it over, she was realizing how hard the task was. But the task of revising the diary, again, is a task of editing. It's a feat of editing. But the task of keeping a diary, and of course she was writing new entries and participating, still an active participant in the diary process at the same time that she was editing the old entries. So she's fulfilling both roles at one time. And I think for a writer, the process of writing a diary has a specific meaning, it's a special meaning, right? It's a kind of crucible where the writer creates their own persona. And I think, especially for a teenage diarist, and right, how many of us may have started to keep a diary after reading Anne Frank's diary and then become discouraged that our own diary doesn't look quite so coherent and neatly wrapped up, and our entries don't end on cliffhangers that then lead us into the next entry, right? That doesn't happen. But the very act of writing the diary, I think, is a statement that you are a writer, right? I am a writer because I am writing a diary. It's a statement that this is something that's important, that you're going to make time to do this, you're going to take up space on the page. And for us, that's just buying a notebook, but for Anne, it was actually finding the paper, and she writes in her diary about having to pillage, for instance, from her sister's chemistry notebook in order to come up with more pages to write on. And so I think, that itself is an act of self-assertion and self-determination before we even get to, all the writing practice that the diary offers. And in a way, the tragedy of that particular notebook being lost, it's a notebook that probably, must have covered the period between December 1942, when Anne was around 13 and a half and had been in the annex for about 6 months, and then about a year later, December 1943. Something happened to change her voice during that year, and because of the diary being lost, we can't pinpoint the exact time, but I think it's reasonable to assume that the thing that happened to her was the ability to process her experience on the page.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the way that there are theorists of life writing who talk about the way that everybody lives, but not everyone has a life. And having a life can often having a sense of your own life can have to do with writing it. And she clearly was kind of acquiring her own life by writing it. And I'm thinking too about, this is the first time I've thought this thought, but in editing her work, she gave herself a past also, and she didn't live to really have much of a past. Like, she died very, very young, and there's something I think very haunting about the way in which, it's like when you hear like a 14-year-old or even a 12-year-old say, "Oh, when I was little," my kids will do this all the time. 6 years old, when I was young, and there's something about her being able to look back at her 13-year-old self and think, "Oh, I was so immature then.
I would never write these things now." She writes, a year and a half later.
Yeah, and she's so 15 when she's saying, like, I renounce that 13-year-old self.
Yeah.
And that also feels like touching time, like the editor, that we can see the editor touching time as a 15-year-old and saying, I renounce that 13-year-old self. So there too, it's like it's not fake there either, because there it's the 15-year-old renouncing being 13.
And I think, the thing we have to understand also is that time must have passed for her
So
in a
slowly,
different way
or
than we
strangely,
understand it. I don't know if it must have been slower or faster or in some ways, or I don't know what, but the idea of, the way she marked her days, and of course she didn't write every day also. That's another myth that often gets thrown around about her. Sometimes you can kind of track her moods by the frequency of the entries. It's clear, she went through kind of a depressed period in the fall of 1943, and one of the ways you can see it is the way that the entries radically slow down. Like, there'll be only two or three in certain months where she just couldn't get up the intellectual and emotional energy to write, I think. But the idea that this is the way that she marks the passage of time, but also that she's creating herself on the page, but that she's using the diary really as an instrument of survival. And I think that's part of what makes it feel so talismanic for people. The way it feels to us like a powerful document, because the reader can sense the way that she's using it to keep herself alive at points.
I want to shift gears a little bit and think about diaries as documents of ordinary life. I mean, obviously, Anne's life was not ordinary. Her circumstances were not ordinary, and her life ended in a highly unordinary fashion. But part of the reason that often people drop writing diaries is they feel like their life is so boring. There's nothing important that's happening. What could I possibly record that would be of interest? And I think that, that's what that diaries do something to ordinary life. They take ordinary life and they put a frame around it or something. And I'm thinking about the way that there were collective archives that were created during the pandemic, and there were projects, putting things online, asking people to just send in diary entries about what is life like. And they're really fascinating. If you look at, I was participating in one during the pandemic, and if you look at them now, they kind of hallow the ordinary, but they also remind us that what we perceive as ordinary is still history. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the ordinary and the extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, what we perceive as ordinary also shifts depending on where we are in our lives, right? What's ordinary to us 30 is not the same thing that's ordinary to us at 40 or 50, right? So there's that. But, in some ways, Anne's life in the annex, I think, was sort of excruciatingly ordinary. And one of the brilliant things about the diary is the way she writes about that ordinary life in a very detailed and often amusing and entertaining way. And that's one of the things she says in the entry in which she's reflecting on what this Dutch minister has asked for in the creation of the archives. She says, in the English translation, she says, wouldn't it be funny if people 10 years from now were to read about what we ate and talked about and how we lived in the annex? And I speak barely any Dutch myself, but I had a Dutch research assistant help me on this book, and he said that she didn't mean really, wouldn't it be funny, but wouldn't it be strange or interesting or for people to read this? And one thing that struck me about that passage is, again, in the revision, she made what I think is a really key change from wouldn't it be funny if people were to learn to wouldn't it be funny if we were to tell what we ate, what we talked about here. It's important to her that it be the Jews who narrate their own story. So I find it fascinating that she's kind of asserting agency over her own text at that point in the revision. But in terms of the ordinary life, she realized that, I think just as so many people realized during the pandemic, that this is something that feels ordinary to us at the time and isn't going to feel ordinary in 10 years from now when we've forgotten all the details about, how the New York Times printed a pattern for us to use to, sew our own masks and that sort of thing. And she realized that as well, and wrote these the descriptions of their menus and recorded the books that she read and the kind of schoolwork that she and her sister and Peter Van Pels did, and put down all these other things, recognizing that this is the texture of a life. This is what makes life worth living, is the way that we appreciate these moments, that we live in the moment, as we like to say today. But the act of writing a diary of these moments is, I think, what it really means to inhabit those moments. And there's a story about Otto that I find so moving. There's a passage in Anne's diary that you probably will remember, in which Peter is hauling up a huge sack of beans to the attic, and it breaks. And all the beans come raining down on top of Anne, who happens to be standing in the stairwell below at just that moment. And at first Peter is angry, and then he can't help but laugh when he sees her standing in this sea of beans. And she says that for weeks after that, whenever anybody went up the stairs, they picked up a handful of beans to bring to the kitchen after that. And when Otto first came back to the annex after the war, he entered the building, he entered the stairway and found 3 of those beans on the ground and picked them up, and he put them in his pocket, and apparently he kept them for the rest of his life. And I see those little beans as a reminder of those days of ordinary life, right, in the annex. That would be something that Otto would treasure so much. He later said that he looked back on those days as blessed because they were all together.
I want to bring this to a close so we have some time for questions from the audience, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about whether you feel proprietary over Anne at all. I have to confess that I sometimes do, and I feel like this is what Anne would say, this is what she would do, And of course I know that that's, I have no access to her beyond the access anybody has, but she is so frequently taken up, and the language that we sometimes use to talk about taking up something, like a person, an icon, is appropriated. And when are people appropriating Anne Frank? When are they using her properly? These are. I'm drawing it in extreme terms, but the uses of Anne Frank and your thoughts on that, especially today, because one of the things that is very much in the air here, of course, and has been spoken at moments over the course of the day, is that we're in a particularly painful and I don't even know how to describe it, on some level surreal time in the way that Anne was in a surreal time for herself.
Yeah, well, the uses and the abuses of Anne Frank, right, for all sorts of political purposes. The last chapter of my book, I mentioned how the chapters are all titled after these different identities that she takes on, and I chose to call the last chapter Pawn because it describes all the different ways in which she's been treated as a pawn for political purposes by all different kinds of people. Some, I think, in a very reasonable and understandable way, like the South African apartheid activists who found her so inspiring, but also a lot of people in our contemporary world. And for instance, I just published on my Substack newsletter a description of the question of whether the people who would assert that Anne Frank, if she were around today, would be an anti-Zionist. And, publish, there's this graffiti that has gone around showing her wearing a keffiyeh, for instance. And so if you want to read more about that, it's on my Substack in all its detail. But the answer
That's not even new because a couple of years ago
it's
there
not
was,
new,
right,
that's right.
yeah, so.
Yeah, it's from, I think, 2017 or 2018, yeah. So people, I guess, so my answer to your question, do I feel proprietary, actually is no. I don't feel proprietary of her at all. And I think part of the reason I don't is because I've spent, a few years now immersed in this world in which, I have an Anne Frank Google alert set up, which pings every day with some new horrifying manifestation of somebody saying, this is what Anne Frank would have thought about this or that or the other. And, I don't want to be one of those people. Don't pretend that we can know anything about what Anne Frank would have thought about anything that she didn't directly write about. And, as you say, her diary is the diary of, of a 15-year-old, and it's all over the place, right? There are a few places in which she writes about politics. Very few, I would say. She's a pretty unpolitical teenager. And so I think that is a particularly dangerous minefield to wade into, the question of how she would have opined on some political question. But in general, no, I think that, frankly, I think Anne Frank belongs to all of her readers. And there's so many of them, right? There's so many people who love the diary and have been affected by it, and whose lives have been changed by it. And in fact, I feel so strongly that I don't own Anne Frank in any way that I dedicated my book to Anne's readers. And when my husband saw that, he was like, wait, what about me? What about your family? Haven't we been here supporting you through the miserable writing of this book? And what I said to him was that this book doesn't feel like mine to give away. Hopefully there will be another one after this that will feel more personal in that way. But this book feels like it belongs to something that's bigger than me.
Thanks. I think that's a wonderful place to pause. And I will now turn it over, to give people time to raise their own questions. I want to give people a minute to gather thoughts. And so while you're gathering I see we have thoughts already. Okay, so should I, what's the best thing, to just hand the microphone, or do you want to just kind of try to speak? Stand up and speak well? Yeah. Okay, I mean, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so I see Ophira had a question. Do you want to just try to ask it and we'll see if we can hear? Yeah. Can you hear?
Yeah, I hear. So I can repeat the question on the mic?
Hi, my name is Ophira. I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and of course I read it in Dutch first. And only now I started reading the definitive edition in English, and it's so strange for me to read it in English, and the translations seem not always I mean, it's very hard, it's almost impossible to translate, I think, because there are all these typical girlish expressions. So I was wondering if you rely only on one translation, or, I mean, yeah, my question is about the translation aspect into English, because she had a very particular style in Dutch. And
yeah, I understand that. So I tried to learn Dutch while working on this book. I studied it, and I learned to, I don't pretend to speak Dutch at all, but I was able to learn to read it in sort of a, in a limited way. I also speak German, so between English and German, Dutch is a closely related language. And I can read enough Dutch to appreciate indeed what you're saying. For the book, I had to choose an English translation to use, and I chose the one that's in the critical edition, which is not the standard, translation used in America. As you say, no translation is perfect, as we all know, and I chose that one precisely because readers would be less likely to be familiar with it. There are places where I could see that things were not quite right, and I, checked them with my Dutch researcher and with Dutch friends of mine, and I actually hired a Dutch translator to do some translations from Dutch sources that weren't already translated into English for my book. So there are places where I've amended or where I've commented on in the footnotes, where I've commented on the translation to try to make things clear. Like there's one entry where Anne talks about not wanting to call her mother mums. And that's rendered in one of the English versions as mumsy, which, as an American, I guess it's a British translation or, a British endearment for a mother that probably was used in the 1950s. But, as an American, this word doesn't work for me at all. So I substituted, I don't even remember what I substituted for it, mom or mommy or something like that. But I used a translation on purpose that would be less familiar to readers, just so that they would maybe do a double take at some of the language and realize that it wasn't, that they're reading it in a foreign language.
Other questions? I wanted to know if, I just want to ask one quick thing and then we'll come to Lynn. Did you look at the page, did you get to look at the pages themselves, the actual diary pages?
I looked at it in the Anne Frank house. I mean, they have the original in a glass case, like on a pedestal under glass. I wasn't gonna ask to have it removed from that pedestal. You can look at, there's a facsimile edition where you can see digital versions of all the pages exactly the way they were. But yeah, I didn't feel like I had to handle the actual pages of the red checked diary, which, as we know, is a small portion of what's actually Anne's diary.
I apologize if you covered this and I just missed it, but what brought you to do this project, this book on Anne Frank now at this time? What was your goal or motive?
Well, it took me a while to kind of find the right approach to this book because, of course, there's so much discourse about Anne Frank out there in the world today. And I think, the question that felt most important for me to answer, and the question also that I get asked most frequently was, what is the importance of Anne Frank in the world today, right? What's her message for us now? And we see it around us in so many different ways. The New York Times columnist Nick Kristof had a column during the Syrian refugee crisis that was headlined, Anne Frank today as a Syrian girl. There's this movie by Ari Folman, Where is Anne Frank, that I know came out here, actually hasn't played in the United States yet, but which an animated movie that shows Kitty of the diary coming to life in modern day Amsterdam, literally rising from the pages of the diary and going in search of her throughout Amsterdam. And she, in the end, comes to the same conclusion as Nick Kristof. She winds up with a family of refugees who are hiding out in a warehouse or something, and says, that she's holding the diary hostage and she's not going to give it back until all these people are given homes. I now don't remember the exact details. And in the material for this movie, Ari Folman says that it was important to him to expand the message of the diary into today's world. And especially, I felt this when reading that, but especially now, it seems to me dangerous to suggest that the diary's message needs to be expanded in some way to be relevant in today's world. And there's been this constant sort of push and pull between this question of whether the diary can have a universalist reading, right? Whether we could see Anne Frank as somehow American and analogize the Holocaust to other conflicts, to other genocides, or whether it has to be particularist, whether it's a story of the Holocaust, full stop. And my answer to that question in this book is that it has to be both things at one time. It has to be at once universalist. It can be profoundly meaningful with a universalist meaning, as we see with these apartheid activists that I've brought up so many times, with just the resonance of the diary around the world. I was so moved by the stories of the people I encountered, some of whom I interviewed for the book, who found inspiration from the diary in the most unlikely places. But at the same time, I think we cannot forget that it's a Jewish text about the persecution of Jews. And I'm sure that I don't need to explain why I think it's so important to remember that.
Hi, I'm Jordana. I'm a creative nonfiction student in our master's program, and I'm in Ilana's class. I wanted to ask about navigating the process of a project that's supposedly, an objective biographical piece of someone who was so clear about how she wanted to be remembered, and how you found yourself did you ever find yourself at odds with the diary and trying to present her in a way that maybe she wouldn't, in a way that she might have edited out, or, kind of embracing how she wanted to be seen? I think it's unusual that, you're presenting a biography, even though you say it's not a biography, of someone who was so clear about how they wanted to be presented. And so did you find yourself kind of at odds with her, or embracing her self-representation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And there's a place in the book where I engage directly with that issue. And so the problem that the diary and its revisions really represent, maybe the biggest problem, is the story of her romance with Peter, which some of you might know, and that's the biggest change that Anne made to her revised version of the diary, is that she took out the entire story of her romance with Peter. And Otto put it back in. So, this is clearly an overriding of her wishes. And I think it's fascinating. I think that Otto is often castigated for censoring parts of the diary. People claim that he censored her, stuff about her menstruation or her criticisms of her mother, neither of which is true, by the way. He left both of those things in his version of the diary. But no one mentions that what is really his true betrayal of her wishes, which is that she didn't want to be remembered as the subject of a teenage romance. She wanted to be a chronicler of the Holocaust and the author of a testimony. And my sense is that she knew that if that romance was in there, that was how she was going to be remembered. And so there's a part of my book where I imagine Anne confronting me over my choice to use that, and in general to use the A version, the rough draft of her diary, as the basis for so much of what's in my book, which I felt was the only choice that a biographer could make for the reasons I said earlier when talking about that, quote unquote fake entry, because this is really the only reliable primary source in that sense. And my answer to it is, the cat is out of the bag. That A version, that rough draft, has now been in print for more than 30 years, and so I'm not breaking any news here. Her memory has been betrayed now many times over, and it would just be false to pretend that all this other stuff didn't exist. And I think what's important is to reflect on, and the choices that Otto made and why he made them. And I'm with Philippe Lejeune in feeling very sympathetic to Otto and the position he was in. I think, you mentioned reading Anne Frank's diary recently. And I would just say that, it's one thing to read the diary as a teenager or a young person, and totally different to read it as an adult, especially as a parent of a child around Anne's age. And to imagine, it's impossible to imagine the kind of heartbreak that Otto must have felt and the position he found himself in when presented with this stack of papers that showed his daughter to him in a way that he had never even imagined that she existed. He said afterwards that he realized that he had never really known her. And I think, it's impossible to judge any of the choices that he made, only to try to understand and appreciate them.
I'm curious to know at what point in the writing process you decided to visit Amsterdam, and when you did, how you determined when it was the appropriate time to go, and then I'm sure it impacted how you wrote the story. But I would love to hear sort of some of the expected and unexpected ways that it impacted how you wrote it.
Well, I wish there was a more kind of genuine process-oriented answer to this question, but the answer is as when I could travel easily to Amsterdam, because I researched most of this book during COVID. And so I spent a lot of time poring over, Google Maps and trying to imagine these places. And, I was helped by the Anne Frank House has an amazing website that, allows you to do all kinds of virtual touring and close-ups of the stuff on the walls, and you can visit the house with much more leisure and also in much brighter light than you can in person, which it's kept very dim for obvious reasons. You can also visit virtually the apartment where Anne Frank grew up in Amsterdam, which you can't visit in person because it's used for private housing for refugee writers and artists, but you can tour it on a Google Culture site, for as much time as you want. So, I did feel that it was important to visit Amsterdam at some point. I wrote a lot of the book relying on, as I said, my 40-year-old memories of having visited the annex as a child. And I did want to see it again, for many reasons, but also, to see how the exhibit presented Anne and to understand the way the house, was the kind of message that house has embraced. And by the way, they embrace an extremely universalist message, emphasizing, the relatability of Anne and her message for, everybody around the world for whatever reason. And, they've made that choice, very deliberately for their own reasons. And so when I finally got there, which was, I would say when I was about halfway through the actual writing of the manuscript, but nearly done with the research, it felt very familiar because I had spent so much time looking at everything on the screen that, when I finally was able to visit Anne's neighborhood, I had this moment of deep recognition when I saw her apartment building, as if, oh, I have been here before. But of course, this was not déjà vu. I had not been there in a past life. I just spent so much time looking at it on Google Maps that my feet led me to the right place without even really having to think about it. So, there are moments, there are really only a few moments in the book that were, deeply informed by the things I saw around me in Amsterdam and kind of my own use of my body to measure the physical space and stuff like that. But most of it, if I ever feel like this is a very 21st century answer, most of it was done virtually.
I want to ask one quick thing, because I know there are a lot of students here who write creative nonfiction. And most of the time when we have our conferences, we have poets, we have novelists, and I'm always saying, wait, nonfiction. So can you just maybe say a word about how you came to be a nonfiction writer, and how you kind of, I don't know, we talk about creative nonfiction. Is that something that speaks to you, or how do you describe yourself?
Interesting. It never really occurred to me to be anything other than a nonfiction writer. Well, I'll say I started as a journalist, and that's why. I started off wanting to be a more traditional journalist, a news-type journalist, and eventually kind of fell backward into literary criticism, popular literary criticism, as one might say, when I realized that what I really love is literature, and I wanted to write about it in a way that I felt alienated from an academic way of writing about it, and wanted to write about it for a popular audience. And from literary criticism, I made sort of the lateral step into biography, just because there were many texts, contemporary books, but also from the past, that I felt that the critical lens wasn't really sufficient to approach them with, or I wanted to take a different approach and perspective. I didn't want to be some kind of arbiter. What I've always been most interested in is the creative process, and how artists come to create the works that they do. And I see it as a combination of so many different factors. We tend to focus on inspiration and kind of the spark of creativity, but there are so many other forces that come into play. Personal history, the history of the world, social circumstances, family circumstances, all those different elements. So when I write profiles or when I write biography, that's always the question that I'm trying to answer. And I guess that's the extent to which I see it as creative nonfiction.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions.
So you had said that in no way do you feel like you own Anne Frank. And I'm kind of wondering, when you decide to write a biography about somebody, do you feel like they come to own you in a certain way? Do they join you for your journey? And is it kind of a decision that we make to kind of invite a fellow passenger who we know is going to be with us, L'Orech HaDerech?
I think that's a really lovely question. I think about it almost like a marriage, or a kind of serial monogamy. You are trying to inhabit this other person's mind in as profound a way as you can, mitigated by the distance of time and space and death. Of course you can't ever, but for Shirley Jackson, when I was working on that book, I immersed myself in her archive. I practiced what I came to think of as a kind of method biography. I cooked her recipes. I read all the books that she mentioned. I watched movies that she talked about. I listened to her music. I bought her perfume. Whatever I could do to be closer to this person who, in ways I cannot be close to. But you invest a lot of time and energy in kind of creating this radical empathy with another creator, and hope that they visit you in the way that you are indeed inviting them to. With Anne Frank, the process was very different, mainly because of the lack of that kind of archive and the brevity of her life. But in terms of, I think the biographer's own personal investment isn't any different in terms of the process that you try to go through in order to come as close as possible to understanding the circumstances of another person's life.
We're going to take one more question. Rebecca, you want to go ahead?
I'm curious about your emotional experience of writing this, because obviously her life and her death is so dramatic, and so how did that, just what's been that emotional journey of doing this?
Yeah, it's challenging. I found it, to be honest, I found it harder with my first book, which is also about Holocaust literature. This is a study of around 12 different Holocaust writers of the Holocaust. I found that process really painful, just to immerse myself in the subject matter in that way. And this process was as well. And I'll say I've been reading and thinking about the Holocaust, as I'm sure so many other people here have, really, since I don't remember a time when I wasn't reading and thinking about the Holocaust. And yet, researching this book, I learned something new every day. It made me aware of just how much I hadn't known about different camps. I didn't know anything about the camps that Dutch Jews were deported to, in contrast with Jews from Eastern Europe. There was so much I learned about women's experience in the camps, which I understand was kind of taboo even to ask the question of whether women were treated differently from men at Auschwitz and other places, which I think is a really important part of the story. The way in which the male survivor especially of Auschwitz, but also of other camps, has come to stand for kind of all survivors in our mind, when women's experience, in fact, was quite different in those camps. It was an emotionally challenging process in that way, and I was privileged to have a residency while I was working on this book, where I spent 2 weeks isolated in this really idyllic villa in rural France, which is an incredible privilege, but also it was not great to be alone with my thoughts and Anne Frank for an extended period of time. And I think it's helpful. It's great to have a family. I'm lucky to have a family. I'm lucky to have children. We often complain, writers who are parents often complain about all the interruptions, but sometimes it's good for us to be interrupted. It's good to have to come out of this world and, make dinner, or walk the dog, or, the things that keep us sane while we're thinking about these subjects.
All right, I want to thank everybody for participating and thank Ruth for coming to be with us.
Thank you so much, Ilana.
And we hope you'll join us tomorrow for another full day, and we look forward to seeing you.